There is a specific kind of quiet that belongs to an empty house. It's a peaceful, resting quiet. But when I walked through my front door that Tuesday afternoon, the quiet I stepped into was entirely different. It was heavy. It was the kind of silence that holds its breath. I wasn't supposed to be home. I had been in Denver for a corporate logistics conference that wrapped up a full 24 hours ahead of schedule. Usually, my colleagues use that extra time to hit the hotel bar or sleep in, but all I wanted was to get back to my wife. Cassandra and I have been married for 23 years. She is a sharp, fiercely capable woman who can negotiate a car price down to the penny and still remember the name of the salesman's golden retriever. After over 2 decades together, the absolute best part of my day is still walking into our kitchen and seeing her standing there. I booked the first flight out, deciding not to call. I wanted to surprise her. As I turned my car onto our quiet suburban street, the afternoon sun casting long, lazy shadows across the lawns, I felt that familiar warmth of coming home. That warmth vanished the second I pulled into my driveway and saw my son's leased luxury SUV parked near the garage. Preston is 26. He is my only child, and if I am being perfectly honest with you, the last few years with him had been an exercise in parental patience. Preston was always chasing the next big thing, cycling through entrepreneurial ventures that somehow always required a seed money loan from his old man, while never quite producing a return. 2 years ago, he married Lindsay. And Lindsay is a woman who works 15 hours a week at a boutique, but somehow always carries a Prada bag and drives a car with a payment the size of a mortgage. For a long time, I chalked it up to millennial growing pains. I told myself they just needed time to figure out the real world. But Preston never did spontaneous pop-ins on a Tuesday afternoon. He only ever came by when he needed a check or a cosigner. I parked, grabbed my suitcase, and walked up the front steps. My key turned in the lock with a loud, metallic clack that echoed through the foyer. I stepped onto the hardwood, dropping my bag by the umbrella stand. "Cassandra!" I called out. Nothing. I walked down the hall and stopped dead in the archway of the living room. Preston and Lindsay were sitting side by side on our leather sofa. The television was off. There was no music playing. Neither of them was holding a phone or a magazine. They were just sitting there in the dead center of a perfectly silent room. But that wasn't the detail that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was their faces. If your father is supposed to be 2 states away in Colorado, and he suddenly walks into the living room on a Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon, your natural reaction is surprise. You jump. You say, "Dad, what are you doing here?" You show confusion. Preston didn't flinch. His eyes simply tracked me as I walked into the room. It was a cold, deeply calculated stare. Beside him, Lindsay offered a tight, nervous smile that didn't reach her eyes. A smile so entirely out of place that my stomach physically dropped. "Preston," I said, my voice suddenly feeling too loud in my own house. "What are you doing here? Where's your mother?" Preston leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his face a perfect mask of rehearsed composure. "Dad, we were just about to call you." "Call me about what?" "Mom had an episode this morning," he said, his voice flat, completely devoid of the tremor you would expect from a son talking about his mother. "A severe seizure-like episode. The ambulance took her to Mercy General." For a second, the room spun. The floor felt like it was dropping out from under my shoes. Panic, raw and blinding, flooded my chest. I couldn't breathe. My brain started firing in a million different directions. Cassandra didn't have a history of seizures. She was perfectly healthy when I kissed her goodbye at the airport 3 days ago. "Is she alive?" I choked out, my hands trembling so violently I had to ball them into fists. "She's in the ICU," Lindsay piped in, her voice artificially sweet. "We've just been so worried, Warren." I looked at them. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The adrenaline was screaming through my veins, urging me to run, to drive, to get to my wife. But even through the blinding haze of my own terror, a very quiet, very cold realization settled into the back of my mind. I was falling apart in front of them. And they were just sitting there, perfectly still, watching me like an audience waiting for the next act of a play to begin. I don't remember the drive to Mercy General. If you asked me what route I took or how many red lights I ran, I couldn't tell you. I operated purely on the kind of primal, blinding fear that shuts down every part of your brain except the desperate need to get to the person you love. When I finally sprinted through the sliding glass doors of the ICU wing, my shirt was clinging to my back with sweat. I was intercepted at the nurses' station by Dr. Beverly Nash. She was a formidable woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and the steady, unshakable demeanor of someone who had spent decades pulling people back from the brink. She didn't offer me a sympathetic smile or a gentle pat on the arm. She simply said my name, asked me to follow her into a private consultation room, and closed the door until it clicked shut. "Mr. Trevor, your wife is stable for the moment, but her kidneys are failing, and her neurological function is severely compromised," Dr. Nash began, her voice low and clinical. "When she was brought in, we ran a standard toxicology panel because her symptoms, the sudden seizures, the neuropathy, the hair loss she's apparently been suffering from over the last few weeks, didn't align with a viral or bacterial infection." She paused, folding her hands on the table between us, her eyes locked onto mine. "We found lethal levels of a heavy metal called thallium in her blood." I just stared at her. The word sounded foreign. "Thallium? Like from old pipes? How does someone even get exposed to that?" "They don't," Dr. Nash said flatly. "Not accidentally. Thallium is a highly toxic, tasteless, odorless metal. It used to be the primary ingredient in commercial rat poisons before it was banned for being too dangerous. It doesn't strike all at once. It accumulates in the tissue, slowly shutting down the body's organs over a period of months." She leaned in just a fraction of an inch. "Mr. Trevor, I have already notified the authorities. What is happening to your wife is not environmental. It is deliberate. Someone has been methodically poisoning her." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The air rushed out of my lungs. I gripped the edge of the table so hard my knuckles turned white, trying to anchor myself to reality as the room tilted. Poisoned. Dr. Nash led me down the hall to Cassandra's room. I thought I was prepared, but the moment I crossed that threshold, my heart shattered completely. This was Cassandra, my beautiful, vibrant Cassandra who practically vibrated with energy, who could command a room just by walking into it. The woman lying in that hospital bed was a ghost. Her skin was a translucent, ashen gray. Her cheeks were hollowed out, and the thick, dark hair I had loved brushing from her face for 23 years looked terribly thin against the stark, white hospital pillow. She was surrounded by a cacophony of beeping monitors, an oxygen tube taped beneath her nose, multiple IVs snaking into her bruised arms. She looked so incredibly fragile. I collapsed into the plastic chair beside her bed and took her cold, limp hand in both of mine. I pressed it to my forehead, and the dam broke. I sobbed until my chest physically ached. I wept for the pain she must have been enduring in silence, and I wept from a profound, agonizing guilt. How had I not seen this? How had I brushed off her recent fatigue as just stress or getting older? I was her husband. It was my job to protect her, and I had failed. But as I sat there, listening to the rhythmic, mechanical hiss of her ventilator, the sorrow slowly began to burn away. It was replaced by something else, something dark, hot, and unbreakable. I looked at the dark bruises on her arms, and a terrifying clarity washed over me, thallium, tasteless, odorless, ingested over a period of months. My mind began flipping through the calendar, working backward. Who had access to her? Who prepared her food? We rarely ate out. I made dinner most nights, but I was at work during the day. And then, a memory struck me with the force of a lightning bolt. 4 months ago. Cassandra had slipped on the back patio and badly sprained her wrist. She couldn't cook or drive for a few weeks. The very next morning, Lindsay had shown up at our front door, playing the role of the doting, a deeply concerned daughter-in-law. Lindsay, who normally couldn't be bothered to text us back, suddenly had the time to drop by every single morning. She had brought a massive, expensive-looking canister of what she called a special organic protein powder to help Cassandra's tissue heal faster. I could hear Lindsay's overly sweet voice echoing in my head from that morning. "Don't worry about breakfast, Warren. I'm going to come by every morning and make Mom her smoothie. I'll make sure she drinks every last drop." And she did. Every morning for 4 months, Lindsay had stood in my kitchen, blending up that powder, handing the glass to my wife, and watching her swallow it. I slowly lowered Cassandra's hand back to the bed. I stood up, the fluorescent lights of the ICU suddenly seeming blindingly bright. I knew exactly how it had happened. And worse, I knew exactly who was sitting in my living room right now, waiting for the phone call to tell them my wife was dead. I didn't confront them, not yet. Confrontation is for people who want an argument. I wanted annihilation. Instead of going back to the waiting room, I slipped out of the hospital through the ground floor pharmacy exit. I needed to go home, and I needed to get there before Preston and Lindsay realized I wasn't just another grieving, panicked husband. I drove back to my house, the silence in the car feeling entirely different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was the quiet of a man preparing for war. When I pulled up, Preston's SUV was gone. The house was empty. I bypassed the kitchen and went straight to my home office. I booted up my desktop and started pulling up every piece of financial architecture Cassandra and I had built over 2 decades. We had a joint household checking account that we used for bills, groceries, and incidentals. We kept a healthy buffer in it, and Preston had an emergency debit card linked to it. A remnant from his college days that we simply never deactivated because, well, he was our son. I hadn't looked closely at the itemized statements in months. I didn't need to. I trusted my family. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the bleed. Starting exactly 5 months ago, small, odd increments were being transferred out. $300 here, $450 there. Always just under the threshold that might trigger a fraud alert or make me look twice. I pulled out a legal pad and started tallying them up. Yet the final number sat at the bottom of the page, staring up at me like an insult. $11,400. I traced the routing numbers attached to the transfers. They weren't going to Preston's checking account. They were being funneled into a digital wallet linked to a high-risk cryptocurrency exchange. Preston, the eternal entrepreneur, had apparently been trading on massive margin, betting money he didn't have on digital coins that didn't exist. The market had tanked. The margin calls came due. And to avoid complete financial ruin, he started quietly bleeding his parents dry. $11,000 wasn't a down payment on a new life. It was the desperate act of a drowning man trying to buy a few more weeks of air. But 11 grand doesn't buy you a murder. That kind of theft is pathetic, but it's not homicidal. There was a missing piece and a much larger motive, and I needed help to find it. I picked up my phone and called Curtis Barnes. Kurt and I have been best friends since we were teenagers. He is a senior network security architect for a defense contractor, and he possesses a moral compass that points entirely toward fiercely protecting the people he loves. He arrived at my house in under 20 minutes, carrying a heavy black laptop bag. I didn't waste time on pleasantries. I told him about the Thallium. I told him about Lindsay's daily smoothies. I showed him the $11,000 crypto drain. Kurt didn't gasp or offer empty platitudes. His jaw just tightened into a hard, unforgiving line. "Warren," Kurt said, setting his laptop on the dining room table. "If he's stupid enough to steal from the joint account, he's arrogant enough to leave a digital footprint somewhere else. I need Cassandra's laptop." I brought it to him. For the next hour, the only sound in the house was the rapid, aggressive clacking of Kurt's fingers on his keyboard. I paced the hallway, practically wearing a groove into the hardwood. "Got him," Kurt finally said, his voice deadly quiet. I rushed over. Kurt turned the screen toward me. "About 6 weeks ago, Preston came over to fix the Wi-Fi router, right?" "Yes," I said, my chest tightening. "Cassandra said the internet was dragging, and he offered to run an antivirus update for her." "He didn't run an update," Kurt said, pointing to a string of hidden, malicious code buried deep in her system files. "He installed a keystroke logger. Every password she typed, every email she sent, every bank login, it was mirrored directly to Preston's phone. He's had unfettered access to her entire digital life for a month and a half." Kurt opened a recovered folder of deleted sent emails from Cassandra's account. He clicked on the most recent one. It was an email to Margaret Holloway, our estate attorney. As I read the words on the screen, the final, sickening piece of the puzzle locked into place. Cassandra had been quietly working on a massive surprise. She was restructuring her $2.3 million life insurance policy. For years, Preston had been listed as the primary beneficiary if anything happened to me first. But my brilliant, perceptive wife had apparently grown tired of watching her son squander every opportunity handed to him. The emails detailed her explicit instructions to remove Preston entirely from the policy and redirect the $2.3 million to a charitable trust she was establishing to fund literacy programs for underprivileged kids in the city. "Look at the date," Kurt murmured, tapping the screen. The estate lawyer had replied, informing Cassandra that the paperwork had been drafted, but required a mandatory 30-day processing window before the beneficiary change became legally binding. Preston had read that email. He was drowning in crypto debt, staring down the barrel of total bankruptcy, and he had just discovered that the massive $2.3 million safety net he had always secretly counted on was about to be snatched away forever. He had 30 days to make sure his mother never signed those final papers. I stepped back from the table, the sheer, staggering evil of it washing over me. My son, the boy I had taught to ride a bike, the boy I had beamed at during his college graduation, had sat in his luxury apartment, looked at his wife, and decided that the most logical solution to his financial incompetence was to murder the woman who gave birth to him. The hardest part of betrayal isn't the shock. It's the requirement to pretend you aren't completely shattered while you figure out how to destroy the people who broke you. I stood in my dining room, staring at the keystroke logger Kurt had unearthed. We had the motive and we had the timeline. But Margaret Holloway, our fiercely meticulous attorney, had taught me long ago that knowing the truth and proving it in a courtroom are two very different things. Thallium poisoning is an incredibly difficult charge to prosecute because the timeline of ingestion is so vague. Any decent defense lawyer would argue that Cassandra could have accidentally ingested it somewhere else, or that Preston and Lindsay had no idea what was in the health supplements they bought online. I needed indisputable, undeniable proof. I needed to catch them with their hands in the poison. "Kurt," I said, my voice steadier than it had been all day. "How long does it take to wire this house with cameras? The small ones, the kind nobody sees." Kurt didn't even blink. He simply reached into his massive black laptop bag and pulled out 3 small boxes. "I brought them from my home security rig just in case. Give me 20 minutes. We moved quickly and quietly. Kurt installed 1 micro camera inside the grate of the air conditioning vent directly above the kitchen island, angled perfectly downward. He tucked another behind the molding of the pantry door, giving us a clear view of the trash can and the sink. Within minutes, he had the live feeds routed securely to an encrypted app on my phone. While he worked, I pulled out my phone to lay the bait. My hands were shaking, but I forced my thumbs to type out a text message that sounded exactly like a terrified, helpless father. I sent it to a group chat with Preston and Lindsay. "Hey kids, just got off the phone with the doctors. They still don't know what's wrong with Mom. They are sending a health department official to the house later this evening to test the water and all the food in the pantry, just in case it's severe food poisoning or a botulism outbreak. Lindsay, could you do me a huge favor? Mom is asking for her special face cream and her fuzzy socks. Could you run to the house and pack a small overnight bag for her? I don't want to leave her side right now." I hit send. I stared at the screen, waiting. 3 agonizing minutes passed. Then the 3 little gray typing bubbles appeared. "Of course, Warren, on my way right now. Don't worry about a thing, just take care of Mom." I looked up at Kurt. She took it. We left the house immediately, parking my car 3 blocks over, hidden behind a row of tall hedges at the neighborhood park. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine off, the air conditioning dead, sweat beading on my forehead as I stared at the live camera feed on my phone. Kurt sat in the passenger seat, his eyes glued to the screen. 10 minutes later, the front door of my house clicked open. Lindsay walked onto the screen. She didn't look like a concerned daughter-in-law rushing to pack a bag for a sick woman. She moved with frantic, jerky, panicked energy. She practically sprinted past the stairs leading to Cassandra's bedroom and went straight into the kitchen. I watched on the tiny screen as she yanked open the pantry door. She bypassed the cereal, the pasta, and the canned goods, reaching straight into the back corner. She pulled out the heavy, expensive-looking canister of the organic protein powder, the exact same canister she had used to make Cassandra's smoothies for the last 4 months. "Look at her," Kurt whispered in disgust. Lindsay unscrewed the lid. She didn't even bother looking around. She moved straight to the sink, flipped the switch for the garbage disposal, and began dumping the gray, powdery contents straight down the drain. The heavy whirring of the disposal motor must have been deafening in the empty house. She stood there, running the hot water, violently shaking the canister until every last grain of the poison was washed away into the municipal sewer line. Then, she did the one thing that guaranteed she would spend the best years of her life in a 6x8 cell. Instead of putting the empty canister back in the pantry or tossing it in the kitchen trash where it belonged, she shoved it aggressively into the depths of her oversized Prada tote bag, clearly intending to throw the physical evidence into a random dumpster miles away from our neighborhood. She quickly wiped her fingerprints off the sink handle, took a deep breath to compose herself, and finally headed upstairs to grab Cassandra's face cream. I tapped the screen, saving the high-definition recording directly to my phone and backing it up to Kurt's secure cloud server. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel relief. I just felt a terrifying, icy calm settle over my entire body. I had watched this woman sit at my Thanksgiving table, hold my wife's hand, and smile in my face, and I had just watched her systematically attempt to erase a murder weapon. "Okay," I said quietly, turning the phone off and sliding it into my pocket. "Let's go ruin their lives." I didn't call the police immediately. If I had, Lindsay might have been pulled over with the canister in her bag. And Preston would have immediately lawyered up with the money he was still stealing from us. No, I needed to sever every lifeline they had before the hammer fell. I called Margaret Holloway. Margaret is not just an estate attorney, she is a shark in a tailored suit who has spent 30 years dismantling people in courtrooms. When I arrived at her downtown office with Kurt, I placed my phone on her mahogany desk and played the video of Lindsay dumping the thallium powder. Then, Kurt handed her the printouts of Preston's keystroke logger and the $11,000 crypto drain. Margaret watched the video twice. She didn't gasp. She just picked up her desk phone and began issuing orders with terrifying precision. Within 90 minutes, Margaret and I had executed a complete financial blackout. The joint household accounts were frozen and restructured under a new, secure trust. I revoked Preston's emergency debit access. But we didn't stop there. I called the auto lender for Preston's leased luxury SUV, a lease he had required me to co-sign, and reported that I was immediately suspending all future payments and withdrawing my financial backing. Kurt accessed Preston's crypto wallet and enacted a hard security freeze, claiming fraudulent activity. We turned off their cell phone data plans, which were still tied to our family plan. We systematically locked them out of the modern world. When it was done, I drove back to Mercy General. I needed to be there when Cassandra woke up. Dr. Nash had cautiously predicted she would regain consciousness that afternoon, and I was not going to let her open her eyes to an empty room. I sat by her bed for 3 hours, holding her fragile hand, listening to the steady beep of the monitors. At 4:15 p.m., her fingers twitched against mine. Her eyelids fluttered, heavily fighting against the lingering effects of the sedation and the poison. Finally, those sharp, familiar brown eyes opened. They were cloudy and exhausted, but they were hers. "Warren," she rasped, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm here, honey. I'm right here," I said, leaning in so close my forehead touched hers. She swallowed hard, looking around the stark ICU room. The confusion quickly gave way to a frighteningly sharp realization of how wrong everything felt. What happened to me? It was the hardest conversation of my life. I didn't sugarcoat it, and I didn't hide the truth, because Cassandra would never forgive me for treating her like glass. I held her hand and told her everything. I told her about the thallium. I told her about Preston's crypto debt, the spyware on her laptop, the $2.3 million policy, and the hidden camera footage of Lindsay in our kitchen. I watched the initial shock ripple across her pale face. I braced myself for the tears, for the denial, for the agonizing grief of a mother learning her only child wanted her dead. But Cassandra didn't cry. The exhaustion in her eyes hardened into something so cold, so fiercely maternal, it sent a chill down my spine. She processed the betrayal of her own flesh and blood in a matter of seconds. She squeezed my hand with surprising strength. "Did you lock the accounts?" she whispered. "Every single one," I said. "Good," she breathed, closing her eyes. "Destroy them, Warren. Don't leave a single piece standing." She didn't have to wait long. Not even 20 minutes later, the heavy wooden door to the ICU room swung open. Preston and Lindsay walked in. They were carrying a massive bouquet of brightly colored lilies, but beneath the practiced expressions of concern, there was a frantic, wild panic in their eyes. The financial blackout had hit, their cards were declining, their phones had no data, and the walls were rapidly closing in. Preston saw me standing by the window. He plastered on a smile that didn't reach his eyes by 50 miles. "Dad, we rushed right over. Lindsay went to the house to get Mom's things, but, Dad, something weird is happening with the bank accounts. My card just declined at the gift shop." Lindsay hovered behind him, clutching her Prada bag, the same bag that currently held the empty thallium canister. "We're just so stressed, Warren. How is she doing?" I turned away from the window. I didn't yell. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke in the calm, flat tone of a man reading a grocery list. "She's doing well, Lindsay. Dr. Nash said the thallium levels in her blood are beginning to drop." The color drained out of Lindsay's face so fast, it looked like a medical emergency. The bouquet of lilies in Preston's hands trembled slightly. "Thallium," Preston choked out, trying desperately to maintain his mask. "What? What is that?" "It's a heavy metal," I said, taking a slow step toward them. "Tasteless. Odorless. Takes a few months to build up to a lethal dose. You usually have to hide it in something strong, like an organic protein smoothie. For example." Lindsay made a tiny, strangled sound in the back of her throat. She took a step backward toward the door. "Dad, I don't know what you're talking about," Preston stammered, his voice rising in panic. "Are you saying someone did this to her?" "I'm not saying it, Preston. The camera inside the kitchen air vent is saying it." I pulled my phone out of my pocket and held it up. The one that recorded Lindsay dumping the powder down the garbage disposal 3 hours ago. The silence in the room was absolute. The beeping of the heart monitor seemed to echo off the walls. Preston's jaw worked, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit, a lie, a story, an excuse. He realized his crypto accounts were frozen. He realized I knew about the keystroke logger. He realized the $2.3 million was gone forever. "Oh, the flowers are a nice touch, though," I said softly, looking at the lilies. "You can give them to Margaret Holloway's paralegal. She's waiting for you in the hallway." Preston whipped his head toward the door. Through the narrow glass window, the silhouettes of 3 uniformed police officers were waiting in the corridor. Watching the police walk into that hospital room and arrest my son is a memory that will be burned into my retinas for the rest of my life. There was no dramatic struggle, no screaming match. The officers simply stepped through the door, pulled Preston's arms behind his back and locked the steel cuffs around his wrists. The metallic click echoed sharply over the rhythmic hiss of Cassandra's ventilator. Lindsay dropped the bouquet of lilies onto the linoleum floor. She didn't look at Preston. She didn't look at me. She just stared blankly ahead as an officer read her Miranda rights, her hands cuffed in front of her so they wouldn't have to pry the Prada bag, and the empty thallium canister inside it from her shoulder. They were marched out of the ICU and paraded through the crowded hospital lobby, a highly public humiliation that Margaret had undoubtedly orchestrated with the precinct captain. I thought the hard part was over. I was wrong. The hardest part was realizing that the people you raised can possess a capacity for self-preservation that completely overrides any sense of loyalty, even to each other. Once they were in custody, the illusion of their partnership shattered entirely. Faced with the reality of 25 years to life in a state penitentiary, Lindsay lasted exactly 3 hours in the interrogation room before she flipped. Margaret called me later that evening to deliver the news. Lindsay had taken a plea deal. She spilled everything to the detectives. She confessed that Preston was drowning in crypto debt and had installed the spyware on Cassandra's laptop. She told them how Preston had panicked when he read the email to the estate attorney, realizing he had 30 days to secure the $2.3 million life insurance payout. But the most damning part of her confession was how she painted herself as the victim. She claimed Preston had manipulated her, telling her the thallium was just a strong sedative to keep Cassandra docile, while he figured out how to forge her signature on the trust documents. It was a pathetic, easily disprovable lie, but it gave the prosecution the nail they needed for Preston's coffin. The trial took place 8 months later. It lasted exactly 11 days. Cassandra and I sat in the front row of the gallery every single day. She was still recovering, leaning heavily on a cane, her hair styled short to hide the thinning from the poison, but she insisted on being there. She wore sharp, tailored suits, sitting perfectly upright, staring straight through the defense table. Preston's lawyers tried every trick in the book. They tried to argue the thallium was a tragic accident, a tainted batch of supplements bought off a shady internet forum. They tried to claim the keystroke logger was just a clumsy attempt to help his mother remember her passwords. But they couldn't argue with the digital footprint. Kurt took the stand and methodically dismantled their defense, laying out the timeline of the crypto debt, the spyware installation. Thus, in the exact moment, Preston read the email about the life insurance. But the climax of the trial, the moment the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, was when Lindsay took the stand. She wore a drab, gray jail jumpsuit, her expensive highlights grown out into a dull, messy brown. She sat in the witness box, refused to look at Preston, and testified against the man she had married. She walked the jury through every single morning she had stood in our kitchen, blended the poison into Cassandra's smoothie, and handed the glass to my wife. I watched Preston's face as his wife buried him. His smug arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a deep, terrifying rage. The charming, entitled boy I had raised had entirely vanished. There was nothing left in that chair but a stranger. It took the jury 4 hours to reach a verdict. When the judge asked the foreman to read it, Cassandra reached over and gripped my hand with the strength of a vice. We didn't flinch. Lindsay was sentenced to 15 years in a state facility for her cooperation, pleading guilty to aggravated battery with a deadly weapon and conspiracy. Preston didn't get a deal. He was convicted of attempted murder in the first degree, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The judge, a stern man who looked physically disgusted by the details of the case, didn't mince words during the sentencing. He called Preston's actions a breathtaking display of pure, unadulterated greed. Preston was sentenced to 30 years in a maximum security prison without the possibility of parole. When the gavel fell, the sound cracked through the courtroom like a gunshot. Preston finally looked back at us as the bailiffs pulled him to his feet. He looked terrified. He looked small. He looked like he wanted me to save him one last time.
I didn't blink. I just tightened my grip on Cassandra's hand, turned my back on the stranger in the orange jumpsuit, and walked my wife out of the courtroom and back into the sunlight. It takes a long time to scrub the ghost of a betrayal out of a house. For the first few months after the trial, I found myself avoiding the kitchen in the mornings. I couldn't look at the blender on the counter without seeing Lindsay standing there, smiling her vacant smile as she poured a slow death into a glass. I couldn't look at the spot on the patio where Cassandra had sprained her wrist without thinking about how that one small accident had set the entire nightmare into motion.
But Cassandra is not a woman who allows ghosts to pay rent. About 6 months after the gavel fell, I came downstairs on a Saturday morning to find her standing in the middle of the kitchen. She was leaning on her cane, the morning sunlight catching the silver that had grown into her hair. She looked at the walls, then at the countertops, then finally at me. "Warren," she said, her voice carrying that familiar commanding cadence I hadn't heard in over a year. "We are gutting this kitchen. I hate this tile. The cabinets look entirely too sad, and if I have to look at that blender one more time, I am going to throw it through the front window." I smiled, a real, deep, chest-aching smile. "Whatever you want, Cass. We'll call a contractor on Monday." "I already called 3, she said smoothly, turning back to the stove to flip a pancake. "They're bringing samples on Tuesday." That was the turning point. That was the moment I knew my wife was truly back. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was reclaiming the space. We didn't just rebuild the kitchen. We rebuilt the life Preston had tried to steal. 2 months after the renovation was finished, we officially launched the charitable trust. Cassandra finalized the paperwork with Margaret, legally sealing the $2.3 million life insurance policy away from anyone who shared our last name. We attended the opening of the first community literacy center funded by the trust, watching dozens of underprivileged kids unbox brand new books. Cassandra stood at the podium, vibrant and sharp, speaking with a passion that made my chest swell with pride. She took the money that was meant to be a motive for murder and turned it into a foundation for the future. That night, to celebrate, we went to our favorite little restaurant downtown. When we sat down in the dimly lit booth, Cassandra didn't even open the menu. She looked across the table at me and said, "I want Thai food." I laughed, remembering the exact thought I'd had on that Tuesday afternoon when I landed early from Denver, how I had just wanted to surprise her with her favorite pad thai and sit across from her without a laptop between us. "Extra spicy?" I asked. "Warren," she said, narrowing her eyes in that devastatingly sarcastic way I loved so much. "If I can survive 30 days of rat poison, I can survive a level 5 curry. Do not test me." We ordered enough food for 4 people. We ate, we drank wine, and we laughed. And as I watched her gesture wildly while telling a story about the contractor who tried to overcharge her for the backsplash, a profound sense of peace finally settled over me. People ask me sometimes how I sleep at night, knowing my only son is sitting in a concrete cell for the next 3 decades. They ask if I ever feel guilty or if I wish things had gone differently. I tell them the truth. You cannot choose what is in someone's heart, even if they share your blood. You cannot control the darkness they allow into their lives when the lights go out. But you absolutely have a choice in how you respond when that darkness comes for the people you love. I came home early, I turned on the lights, and I made damn sure that the people who tried to break my family faced the agonizing consequences of their own greed. Oh, I don't regret a single second of it. That's the job of a husband. That's always been the job. If you've ever had to cut toxic people out of your life, or if you've ever trusted someone who turned out to be a stranger, let me know your story in the comments. And if you believe that loyalty isn't just a word, but a promise, make sure you hit that subscribe button. There are plenty more stories coming where the bad guys get exactly what they deserve. Stay safe out there, and hold your loved ones close.